streams to get started. It looks like Twitter is not connecting today, so I'm sorry, Twitter. Maybe another day. Let's see here. We're live on TikTok. We're live on YouTube. We're live on Instagram, and we are live on Facebook. Welcome, folks, to Constitutional Conversation number 9. Today is a special edition of the Constitutional Conversation series. We're not specifically talking about any of the proposals in the Reconstitution itself, but we are talking about a really important, really exciting, and really innovative project that one of my partners in the Reconstitution, Nate Kaufman, who's here with me today, is behind putting together, formulating, conceptualizing, and writing, and we are officially launching that as of this week. It's a new kind of political quiz, and we'll tell you all about it in a moment. Very different than anything you've seen before, and I think will really transform the conversation we have around politics and ideology and self-awareness around the politics you stand for. You can check it out with us at pluralpolitics.com. We'll share a screen, not on TikTok. Sorry, that's just like not a possibility, but for the other viewers out here, we will share our screen so you can get visibility into that. But before I continue with my rant and rave, Nate, why don't you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about yourself and what inspired this project.
Okay. Hi, everybody. I'm Nate. I'm Nate Kaufman. I've been part of Reconstitution since almost the beginning, but I haven't been so much a part of our launch and the public-facing part of it. One reason for that is I work for the government, so there's sort of some conflict of interest kind of stuff. But anyway, I'm Nate. Originally, I'm from Pennsylvania. Now I live in Washington, D.C. I work for the Treasury Department. That's my day job. And then after work, I work on Reconstitution, and I've been working on this quiz for a while. I think it started in a session of Recon. We were talking, it was sort of after we talked about the document itself and our ideas for different things. And then we just, a lot of the time we would just riff about politics or whatever was going on. And we were talking about our dissatisfaction with a lot of quizzes that are out there. Especially a lot of the more popular quizzes. When you take them, what they do is they make you a little point on a grid. And we talked about how we didn't like how reductionist that is. We talked about how wouldn't it be great if there were a quiz that would give you a more pluralistic idea of your politics, and that would give you a sense of self, a sense of what it means to be political, that had more dimensionality to it than just reducing everything to a little point. And so that I got to thinking, I was like, I think we could actually do that. I think that could be not too difficult to program and code and make a reality. So then I got to work on this thing, which became Plural Politics. Pluralpolitics.com. Go take it now. So there's like two things that I thought were wrong with older versions of political quizzes. One is that it's reductionist in the political sense, which is to say, it puts you on a grid. It makes you a little point on a grid. It says you are for example, left-wing authoritarian or a libertarian conservative or something like that. This is what you are. I wanted to expand that and give a sense of the different dimensions that exist within the container that is a person. Not the point, but the container. So the Plural Politics Test gives you a whole big spread of your political associations, even when those associations contradict with each other. As, for example, obviously left-wing economics and right-wing economics are contradictory metrics. And yet it happens in real life that people often have pretty strong opinions that are on either side, as I do. I have many opinions like that. So I find it very hard to say whether I'm on the left or the right. I take what I think would work in a different context or a specific context. So that's the political part. And then once you do that, you can give some more information about meta-political metrics, or how a person is political, the way in which someone is political. So not just that you have an authoritarian respecting predilection or left wing, but the way in which you hold these things and how they interact with each other. So we do that too. We give you a circular bar graph of your results. And we're using, it's called the Nolan Chart. This is where it comes from, these metrics that people are familiar familiar with, this authoritarian, libertarian, left-wing, and right-wing economic picture. We give you that, and then with that, we give you a label of how your particular results work together to create a political profile or a meta-political profile. So, for example, we could say you're a moderate. If maybe you can show the results here, Ari.
Yeah,
you can show a
absolutely.
picture of the results. I don't, it's kind of conceptual just to talk about.
I'm going to share my screen so that folks can see. And again, I apologize for those of you on TikTok who won't be able to see my screen. If you do want to see it, join us on Facebook, YouTube, or Instagram.
Or just take the test.
Or just take the test at pluralpolitics.com. This is sort of what the test looks like. This is question 30 of 30. But I will click a couple of options so you can see what the results look like, which actually, if you're on TikTok, I have a green screen behind me, which shows you what that graph sort of looks like, and we'll explain that in a moment.
So here we go. So on the right, it looks quite a bit like some tests that y'all are probably familiar with already, except it expands outward from the center. Imagine the self in the center with all these sort of winds of political appreciations coming out from that. Then on the left, we see you are an expansive pluralist. Now, this label on the top is really made up of the two labels below it. Your politics are strong, for one thing. What this indicates is that your results, Ari's results here, and I think these are just random answers,
pretty consistent.
They expand pretty far outward from the center. So this user here believes a lot of stuff. They clicked a lot of different answers in the test. So they're really not afraid to put themselves out there politically. So they're strong. And then you get down and see the viewpoint diversity is eclectic. Now, what this means is how the different quadrants here relate to one another. In this case, they're all pretty close together. There's not one that juts way out like liberty loving is the prime motivator and everything else is quite weak. In that case, you wouldn't say that they're eclectic. In this case, this person has all kinds of beliefs that are just working together somehow, even though on the face of it, they are contradictory. So this person's eclectic. This would be a pretty interesting person. I don't know. Maybe we just stop there, Ari, in terms of describing the test.
Yeah, I'll just chime in and say, firstly, I know we have, it looks like a few people on Facebook and YouTube watching, so feel free to comment, and we're happy to respond to questions about this. But I will say, just I guess from my perspective, in listening to Nate as he sort of ideated this and executed on this, thank you, Timur Toth, I appreciate it. The idea of this test is, to put it really in a sentence, is when you take your average political quiz or the traditional political compass test, it puts you on a grid as a dot. You're just a dot. And you're a liberal, and this is right. This is reflective of our culture, which is we are grouped into these tribes. You're a liberal, you're a Republican, you're a libertarian, you're a socialist. But we are all more than just that thing, right? We all can't be boxed in that cleanly. There are people who are pro-gun and pro-choice. There are people that are pro-life and pro-gun control. And so all of these things, we are much more diverse in our perspectives than these brands that get put on us. And so what this does is it tries to show both how eclectic your diversity of views are. So maybe in some cases, depending on the circumstance that you're applying ideology to, you may be more liberty-loving or authority-respecting or left economics or right economics. And then on the other side, there may be issues that you just aren't strongly opinionated on. Like maybe you're like, you know what? I don't know. Like I'm a man, and so abortion, really, like just let someone else think about it because I don't get abortions. Now, I know that people have their morality and all of their, strong opinions on this either way, but my point in that saying that is there are issues that you may just not have a strong opinion on, or maybe you're just not informed enough and you're really self-aware of the fact that you don't understand economic theory and that's just not something that you care about. So the combination of those two factors, how strongly opinionated you are on the full range of issues from economics to social issues to racial issues to international issues, etc., to your viewpoint diversity, which is the number of different angles you can look at problems from, conservative angles, liberal angles, libertarian angles. You combine those two things and you become sort of this more there's more options and more dimensionality to explaining who you are and what your politics are. And so I think the key example that I always go to understand this is that if you look at the political compass test and you are a dot right in the center, you are just centrist central, and so is the person down the street from you. You might have actually completely different views on every single issue, but on that test, you look exactly the same. That to me means there's a problem with that test, or at least that test is reducing the complexity and the nuance. And that's right. That's the source of a lot of our problems as far as having political conversations in this country, because we have overgeneralized, oversimplified, tribalized ourselves into these identities that really aren't good reflections of the complexity and nuance that we have within us. And so what this does is it separates that out, because I may be a moderate centrist in that, I don't really care about politics. So that's why I'm that center dot. Whereas the person down the street from me may be that center dot because they really just think that every perspective has some validity to it, and they're really into politics, and they think there's a way to synthesize all of these things into creating better policy. And those are two very different people with the same plot point. In this test, the plural politics test, they would look very different. One, they would be very balanced in the same way. They'd both sort of look sort of equal in each quadrant, but one would look really large and one would look really small. So ultimately, this is a reflection of that additional layer of dimensionality. Now, I know I said that I was going to explain it in a sentence, and that was like a 3-minute monologue. But
that's what you do, Ari, but we love listening to all your sentences, so it's fine.
I'm glad. And I want to apologize to the people on TikTok. I did not mean to use abortion as an example. I know that is a polarizing thing, and that now you guys are going at each other in the comments. Please drop it. That's not what this conversation is about. We're not talking about a specific policy or specific issue, whether it's social or anything. What we're talking about is that there is more nuance to our politics, not about any particular issue. So being able to have conversation without getting wedged into specifically abortion or specifically guns or any of these issues, the idea that we all actually have very complex views and they differ from issue to issue, rather than saying we don't get the combo meal, right? This is all sort of like a la carte. On each issue, you may have a different opinion, and they don't have to align necessarily the same way everyone else who has stances on these issues.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and in fact, there's 6 different topic areas in the test. So it, I think one of them is about abortion. One's about gun control. I stayed away from wedge issues. They're in there because they're important, but it's really a pretty expansive view of it. Is biased toward American politics because I'm American, and you can't get away from a certain degree of particularism in that. But
Nate, we have a couple of questions that have come in, or one comment that I think is valuable to talk about. Again, I'm not going to address these abortion things because that's not what this is about. We have one comment and one question. So let's start with the comment from TikTok, which is, my views are not that complex. I mind my own business. I'm not a racist or a misogynist. Now, I would like to I think in saying all of what we just said, there is complexity available to all of us, but some of our views are not that complex, and that's okay, right? Mm-hmm. Ultimately, that would be sort of someone who has a very either doesn't care about politics that much, and like you said, you mind your own business, and you're not a racist or a misogynist, and you just want to stay out of politics. But if you took another political test, you might be indistinguishable from someone who actually cares a lot about everything. Maybe they are racist or misogynistic, but because you both average out to the same point right in the center where it's sort of this like average, you lose the complexity and you lose the distinction from someone whose views are not complex and someone's views who are extremely complex. And so that's almost this meta complexity that we're trying to capture in this test. So hopefully that answers that question. And I know your username is S'mores and Mores. I think that point is arguable because being a racist, a misogynist, is not a political view. I think I was not particularly thinking about racism or misogyny because that's not exactly a political thing. That's a social and cognitive and psychological perspective, or I don't know, Nate, if you have something to say.
Let me just say, this test totally rejects racism, misogyny, or anything like that. What I think some other tests do, and I think we both know what test we're talking about here. Or you mentioned it earlier, the compass.
I just want to clarify, Nate, not that racism or misogyny don't exist. It's just not what the test is about.
Yes. But I'm really giving no avenues for racism. It sort of just totally rejects racism. Unlike some other tests, which I think, especially with more conservative metrics, the metrics for conservatism, or in the case of the political compass, authoritarianism, they really associate that with racism and closed-minded thinking generally, which I really tried to stay away from in this test. I think the authority respecting metric is the one that really is the most different, in the sense that I tried to look for legitimate forms of authority respecting, which is why I call it authority respecting and not authoritarianism in the sense of an ism. And maybe, Ari, you can click on the expand section up there. I give resources for all the different ideologies. And if you go to the authority respecting one, you're not going to find any racist, well, no outwardly racist text here.
You're not going to find Mein Kampf in there.
Yeah, that's what I didn't want to say it. But yes, you're not going to find Mein Kampf.
Now we're going to get all the comments, and that's fine because that's what makes us go viral, right? You got to say controversial things to go viral. But the point is, this is anti-controversial. We're not including that in the conversation.
Everything in here is meant to be expansive. Expansion is really the key motif here. And this goes for the other ones too, liberty loving. I think there are some pathological forms of libertarianism. I tried to stay away from them here. And then here, these are the topics covered in the test at the bottom there.
Yep. And I guess just to say, I know, Nate, you're not on TikTok, so you don't see the follow-up sort of comments from the person that we sort of, S'mores and Mores 13, who we started this avenue from. And S'mores and Mores says, I agree with that. Authoritarianism is symbiotic with what I mentioned. And then said, that's fine, I read it, I think in response to Mein Kampf, which we're not saying it's bad to read Mein Kampf. It's nice to be informed on these issues and understand those perspectives. I'm not sure if you're saying that you agree with Mein Kampf. I assume you're not saying that, but I don't know you well enough to say that. And we're saying, yes, that authoritarianism is symbiotic with what a lot of people's perspectives are, even if they would actually totally disown authoritarianism, right? And I think what we need to do is divorce the idea that authoritarianism bad, right? It is bad in certain applications, such as Mein Kampf, right? You take Mein Kampf, you put an authoritarian lens on it, and bad. You end up with genocide. You take authoritarianism and you apply it to a public health crisis like COVID, and actually that's how you get control of the crisis. And does that mean that it should go, we always have to find a balance, but ultimately, and if, again, going back to what I was saying earlier, there's no right or wrong to that. It's just, that's what your perspective is that authoritarianism is valuable in that circumstance.
Yes. With every answer is meant to be something that a reasonable person, in my opinion, because it all comes down to a test maker, a reasonable person might believe. There's nothing in here that is really off the wall.
Yep.
Basically.
And S'mores and Mores qualified here. No, I try to force myself to read things that I disagree with, which is ultimately really what we're trying to encourage with this test, right? And that's why we have these resources, which I know you can't see, but if you go to pluralpolitics.com and click expand, what we're trying to do is get people to expand their understanding, their appreciation for other views that they potentially disagree with, to understand that, you don't need to completely agree with something, but you may be able to find partial truths in it. Listen, I disagree with a lot of politicians, but that doesn't mean I disagree with that politician on every single issue. So trying to find the nuance in that, and we really appreciate it. And you would really love a couple of our partners in the Reconstitution specifically do exactly what you just said. They try to think of like, what's the thing I disagree with most? And they'll go buy that book and read it to try to find something in it to appreciate. And sometimes they come back really surprised, thinking, wow, like there's actually a lot more here for me to appreciate than I thought. Sometimes they come back saying, there's only a couple things in here, but like, at least I get it now. I disagree with it, but at least I get it. And so we think that's a really awesome thing that you're doing, S'mores and Mores. That's part of what this test is trying to do, is encourage that. And also, by the way, if you take the test, it will direct you to show you the things that you may need some expansion and opening of your mind to. So yeah, I think that's one of the values of the test. And you said, I've been hearing horrors about Karl Marx, ended up reading one of his books and liked it. Exactly. And I think that's, you hear the word socialism, Marxism, Fox News talks about him like he's the devil or like Hitler or something like that. And meanwhile, Karl Marx just had an economic theory, right? And it's actually a kind of interesting economic theory. It works in some cases. It doesn't work in other cases. It depends on how you apply it. People think of it as some sort of like government thing, when it's really like more of an economic thing that has government applications. But again, the nuance gets lost because we have these buzzwords. Oh my God, communism. Oh my God, Marx. Oh my God, socialism. And people panic. But that's because people are collapsing ideas and not actually interested in learning the nuance of them. Mm-hmm. And yes, it's interesting because a lot of conservatives agree with it, even though they dislike him. They believe in controlling your means of production. Yes. And I think that's ultimately because people don't, and again, we could get really systemic about this, but the way our society is organized, ultimately people don't have the amount of time or space that they need to learn these things. Maybe we're not teaching them in school to the extent that we need to get diversity of viewpoints and understanding in people's minds before they graduate, because we think that these things are sort of throwaway or shouldn't be taught. But ultimately, exposure, even to things that we disagree with, is really important.
That's right. Yeah.
We have a bunch of questions.
What theory means, let me be a little nerdy here. What theory means, where it comes from is to see. It comes from the Greek word to see. And that's all it is. It's a way of seeing. So you can read Marx and not come out a Marxist, but you have a new way of seeing. You can't help but to read Das Kapital and not come out with a new way of seeing, which can be applied even piecemeal. Not to a whole policy. You don't have to say, oh, I'm a left-winger now, but you can apply it piecemeal to a certain part of the policy. You can look at how, for example, a lot of the right economic thinkers here think about incentive structures, which are useful even if you're not going to end up being a right-wing economic thinker.
Exactly.
So yes, it's all about seeing. It's all about what this is meant to be really is like a new meme, a graduation from the old meme of a grid and here's where I stand, which was helpful, first of all, in its time, because before that people were thinking hopelessly reductionistically about left and right, which is like, what do you do? It's not helpful. So right. These multi-axis metrics were a good step in the right direction. This is meant to be a further step.
Right. And so Nate, firstly, we're getting a ton of questions both from YouTube, Facebook, and TikTok. So I first want to, I'm going to come to you guys on YouTube and Facebook, I promise, in a moment, but there's just such interesting, like cynicism or, I don't want to call it trolling because it's not, but it's like, I'll read it out loud, which is that, someone said authority respecting LOL, top right authority respecting is full of bootlickers. Someone else said, no, we call that boot sucking. And then that person said, oh shit, y'all found out there is more than one dimension. So now we have two dimensions. So on the latter point, which is the cynicism and the sort of snarkiness, like we really, I want to say is part of just like the Reconstitution, not specifics of plural politics, but we really value curiosity, humility, respectfulness, patience, resilience, and creativity. We understand sort of your jokiness about this, but ultimately We would be curious if you know of a test that does this on 2 dimensions. We would love to see it. We don't know of that. Every test that we've seen really plots a point and makes each individual very unidimensional. And that's what we're trying to do here. Of course, could we go to 3? Could we go to 4 dimensions? Of course. And we're getting there.
Yeah, I think that might be a version 2, is to include even more metrics, because I think these ones are they're not fully inclusive.
And then I think on the point of like the top right, authority respecting being bootlickers or boot suckers, Nate, I would hand it to you. Like, can you think of some examples that might be convincing to folks who are pretty anti-authority that maybe they'd fall into that bucket on?
Go to the expand section. Let's take a look. Yeah. I do get this, and it's I think not the West, but a lot of the culture that we live in doesn't give authority respecting its due whatsoever. And I get it, because authoritarianism in the pathological form is a bad thing. Like, this is to be sure. Aristotle, politics, to go way back. Hobbes, without being a total Hobbesian, of course, just like you don't have to be a total Marxist, he's got some really great arguments in there.
I mean, Nate, let's just put it at the simplest. If you believe that people who murder other people should be tried and go to jail or some other punishment, then in some sense you're authority respecting.
Yeah.
And maybe that's the only thing you believe we should respect authority on. I don't think it is, but just to put an extreme out there, we all have some inclination towards accepting that there does need to be some semblance of authority in society that we can organize around. And that's the purpose of government, right? And so you may think that those are bootlickers or bootsuckers until it's your friend who is murdered, and then suddenly you want justice for that, or you want protection from that person for your other friends and for yourself. So authority respecting may sound, because of the way it's been framed in a lot of political debate, to be boot sucking, boot licking, but ultimately it's really just a principle that we've sort of stigmatized.
Right. Yeah. I mean, you can give a mean name to any ideology if you take it far enough, because everything can be phrased mean.
Yeah. I mean, S'mores and More says, I like the word guideline more than authority. Yeah. But ultimately, again, these are not guidelines. Like, if you murder someone, that's not a guideline, thou shalt not kill, or murder is illegal. That's a law that if you break, there's punishment. And in my opinion, hopefully in most people's opinion, there should be. So then we have someone who doesn't say they're anarchist here, but says, I would protect myself and seek my own justice. I don't need the state to do that. And so then, again, you can take this test, and we have nothing in your perspective. You would just not have anything in that top right quadrant. Yeah. And you know what? Your political viewpoint, which is very unique, I will tell you, you may not need to know this, but is very unique, and that would stand out. And that multidimensionality would stand out, and you wouldn't be reduced to something that you're not. Mm-hmm. So hold on that, TikTok. You guys are having a storm over here, but I'm going to turn to YouTube for a second. Kenneth, who's a very frequent listener and engaged Reconstitution follower, asks a really good question. How is this relevant to the Reconstitution? Which I want to say is, firstly, I think you might have missed the intro, Kenneth, but Nate explains that actually the inspiration for this test came out of, as we were having conversations for the Reconstitution and discussing substantive issues, noticing that what we were doing was ultimately looking at each of these issues through these sorts of lenses and seeing that each of these lenses had some part of a solution to offer depending on the circumstance, and we needed to sort of account for each of these things in developing our solution, thinking through, well, is authority needed in this situation? Is right economics? What's the impact there? And sort of thinking through that multidimensionality, but also, of course, the ability to hold all these ideas in your head at the same time is really important to have a multidimensional perspective and a nuanced and creative approach to politics.
Yes. Yeah. And also on the tactical level, if we're going to try to have a reconstitution in the United States, you got to be able to speak other people's language. Well, you have to be able to bridge that divide and at least have the viewpoint the theory, be able to see what people are talking about when they talk about authority respecting, and to basically get over that trigger, whatever your trigger is. Everybody has a trigger of I don't want to talk to this person.
Yep.
Yeah. To see that at least you have a little bit of it in you goes a long way, I think.
We're all snowflakes, let's put it that way, and let's try to be less so, and let's and that's sort of that principle again. One of the reconstitution principles is be resilient, and what it means to be resilient is to listen and hear other ideas without being triggered, so that you can actually think about it critically rather than emotionally, or rather than rejecting something before you even understand it, which is what a lot of us do. Because as someone noted before, is people hear the word Karl Marx and they're like, oh my God, no, that's like evil. And it's like, did you read Marx? And maybe you would disagree with Marx on 99% of things if you did read him. But isn't it a little rash, and isn't it a little immature to just sort of knee-jerk say no just because that's what you heard? I mean, that's childish, and that's ultimately ignorant. So what we're encouraging is for people to expand their understanding of things before they reject them. And what we think is, if you do expand your understanding of things, you'll probably reject less things, and you'll find partial truths in them, or at least their value in various circumstances.
You'll be more effective politically, you'll be more effective socially, and you'll probably be happier.
Yes, absolutely.
Because you won't feel like you live in a world of enemies anymore.
Yes, exactly. And so I want to turn to the next question from Leonard, who is one of our editors on the second edition of the Reconstitution that we're drafting right now. Hi, Leonard. Hopefully he's still here. I know one person dropped off, but I think he's still here. Do you feel that the economics and authority elements are most fundamental aspects of political identity? If you could use another element, what might it be? Do you feel that these two elements give a good overview of political perspectives without being too complex? I'll let you take that one, Nate.
I don't. I really don't. I have always found these axes a little counterintuitive since high school when I took the test. I found it hard to digest. I didn't know why these were chosen. The reason that I'm using them, however, is because I'm thinking of this project as something of a bridge. Bridging from these metrics, which we all know, like it's a very famous test, the one that this one is superficially similar to, into something more. That being said, I do want maybe in the future, a year or two down the line, to add maybe two more. I don't know what those would be, and I keep asking people. I've been suggested maybe like a sense of how, like essentialism versus constructivism, something like that. Like whether you take your morality to be true and objective, or open, relativistic, open to social construction, whatever. I think that might be a good one. There's other ones too. I don't know. I'm open to suggestions.
I have a thought on this, Nate, and I'm just going to challenge the overall question, I guess, which is, I don't think there are fundamental aspects of political identity. I think just like everything else, and not to sound too postmodern here, but these are constructs that we create to get a better understanding of reality, but they're based on the reality that we live in, which is cultural and social and psychological and political and all of these things. And so ultimately, these emerge out of the history of human development, right? And so right economics and left economics, I guess, understanding all of these pieces, where you stand on them, appreciating them all, and their relationship to each other. Once you do that, that unlocks this sort of final principle of the Reconstitution. And this is, Kenneth, to your question again, which is creativity. You can't be creative about these things until you understand the matrix that you're living in. And this is the matrix we're essentially living in, because this is what has emerged through human history. And this is the way people think about politics and economics. Now, just an interesting story is I was talking to my partner after he took this test, and he didn't fully understand sort of left economics versus right economics, and I was explaining it, and sort of his response was, well, why are those the only two options? I was like, no, it's a spectrum, somewhere in between. He said, yeah, but like, what about something like completely different? And I was like, yeah, like what about a gift economy? And if you've ever read Charles Eisenstein, he writes about that, which is a totally different framework that doesn't fit into left or right. It's sort of like neither. And so, but only until you understand the relationship between left and right? Can you sort of break free of that paradigm that those are the only options? And so the hope here is that by identifying and understanding these fundamental constructed aspects of political identity, we can actually deconstruct them and find something new.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And I don't know if that resonates with you, Nate, but that's sort of my take.
Very much so, especially on those two. Those two are the most obviously constructed. It really only makes sense in a capitalist or post-capitalist system with mixed elements of how the government manages its economy. Which, yeah, it's that one is very historically conditional. The other two, I think, are more fundamental, but not totally fundamental.
Right. I would agree, because there is something to be said about liberty and authority, freedom and obedience, and sort of the individual versus the community, and sort of part and whole, and how those things relate to each other. Left and right economics are more based in sort of like the literature and the studies that have developed over time. I see that it's funny. I was thinking that we may have addressed this question, which is very philosophical and epistemological. But how do you know the difference between knowing what is true versus convincing yourself is true? I ask a lot of theological TikTokers this question, and I'm curious to see how you would answer. I think there's an element of I'm glad. I love epistemology too. Skeptic TikToker, very smart name.
Very smart name.
Very smart name. So I'll answer my take, and then Nate, I'll let you answer. But the question is, how do you know the difference between knowing what is true versus convincing yourself it's true? And I'll tell you my perspective, which again goes to one of these fundamental values that these fundamental 6 values that we have in the Reconstitution, and one of them is be humble. And what I mean about that is intellectual humility. And what I mean by intellectual humility in the context of your question is, I think what we all need to accept is that we don't know what is true, and that everything that we do think is true are things that we've convinced ourselves is true. And truth, right? So what is truth is really, I think, ultimately a big question from the epistemological sort of field. There's a lot of theories of, well, there's the scientific truth, and there's the subjective truth, and there's the objective truth, and there's the moral truth, and the value, all of these different ways of thinking. And then there's sort of the Thomas Nagel, what was it? The view from nowhere. Those sorts. And I kind of like flipping his idea on its head, the view from everywhere. If you could actually embrace the perspective of everything, every perspective on truth, that would be knowing what is true. The problem with that is, of course, there are infinite perspectives, and so it is impossible to actually realize what is true, because that's a limit that is not attainable. There's always more perspective, so we're always getting to a more and more complete truth. And this is something that Nietzsche talks a little bit about, as far as finding truth is all about gaining new eyes and new ways of looking at things, but you're never fully there. And so I think back to what I was saying earlier is that's why intellectual humility and being humble is such an important value to me and to the Reconstitution, which is, if we can all be self-aware of the fact that we're just one blip on this planet in this universe, and we have one perspective, and we can't know it all, let alone maybe even know nothing, that if we're self-aware enough to accept that, that's where growth comes from, and where we can find greater and greater understanding of truth. And then he said, so then we introduce levels of certainty. And sure, but again,
that's all a little heady, isn't it? I mean, right. My sense of it is like Socrates was the wisest man in Greece or the world or whatever the oracle said, because he knew that he knew nothing, and yet he didn't walk around saying,
I have that tattooed on my body, Nate.
Oh, very good. That makes a lot of sense.
Tattooed on my ribs.
Nice. Yeah, that makes sense. And yet, though, this was not a man of no convictions. This is a man who went to die for his convictions, and whose argument was that he believed in the right more thoroughly and authentically than anyone else did. And you read those dialogues, and you get the sense that it's not because he knew everything, he knew that he was right. It's because he was living a life of resonance. It felt right. He didn't feel like he was lying to himself. He was wary of lying to himself. And not that it felt right in a hedonistic sense, but he resonated with what he was doing. I put very much stock in resonance.
That makes
You
a
just
lot
kind
of
of feel it, right? Don't you just kind of feel when you're living your best life?
100%. It is definitely, and that's the subjective angle of it, right? And we need to integrate the subjective truth and the objective truth and the intersubjective truth and the interobjective truth. And that's where integral theory comes into a lot of this, which for those of you who aren't familiar with it, I highly encourage looking it up. Skeptic TikToker says, we certainly know more than zero. Are you a solid, I can never pronounce it, solid.
I wouldn't be
No.
doing any of this crap if I were a solipsist. Okay.
Yeah, I would not, and I am not. My point is that it's a little bit of a paradox, I guess is what I'm saying, is that truth is a paradox in that ultimately the idea of truth is a construct. So the question is, how much of it can we construct in our mind to understand, and how close to the actual thing is it, and is there an actual thing, is what we can't know. But again, this is sort of unrelated to the plural politics test. We could talk about this for many, many hours.
I mean, this is the sort of discussion that I hope people taking the test. I imagine someone making their friend take it or their sibling take it or whatever, and they get into discussions like this. I hope that it naturally goes into a discussion of what do we know, what is the best life, what is wisdom, etc.,
right.
etc.
And I'll just say,
like, oh, you're a left-wing authoritarian, ooh, you know.
And you know, an example of the need for humility is someone here said, I'm Charles Martel said, Plato was forced to drink hemlock.
Socrates was, yes.
Not exactly. So like, and I understand why you would think that, like mixing up people, but like we always need to be self-aware that we are humans and imperfect and our memory is imperfect, and just like acknowledging that maybe like we're wrong about certain things is key to learning.
He was forced to drink it, but he had a chance to get out. They kind of left the gate open for him to escape, and he chose not to because he believed in his convictions.
Right.
Anyway.
Thank you, Skeptic TikToker. Feel free to follow us. We have lots of interesting videos on here, and we do this every other week. I want to answer, Kenneth has a couple of other questions. Cool point, I am Charles Martel. Yes, lots of things we don't know, just like elephants don't know that sharks exist. Love that. Great example. Kenneth said, just another political litmus test as far as I'm concerned, probably less predictive value than the old-fashioned single point, in my humble opinion. My response, and Nate, I'll let you take yours, but like, who said that it needs to have predictive value, or that's the point of this test? I think that's the assumption maybe you're projecting on it that makes it less valuable to you, but I don't see that as the value of this. It's a little bit more about self-understanding of your viewpoints. But Nate, feel free.
Yeah, the reason I made it is not to be descriptive or predictive so much as to have an educational effect. Although I tested the questions empirically, and it is predictive, actually.
Yeah, we do. There is a paper on the website that you can check out to see the research behind it, which it does have some predictive value.
I mean, the interesting thing to me is that empirically, what you see when you look at the data is that people do tend either to expand or not expand inward and outward on this graph here, eclectically, more so than they end up being like fully right economic and liberty loving, for example, like the classic libertarian sort of person, and have no appreciation for either of the other two. That's quite rare statistically.
Yep.
So I took that as sort of inspiration to keep going when I saw that data.
And I want to clarify for Long D Batty on TikTok. No, that is not my political identity behind me on this green screen. That's just an example. Mine is actually really large and expansive, and definitely leans more towards left economics. That's just an example screenshot to understand the concept. Kenneth also asked, and this is a while ago. I apologize, Kenneth, if you're still here, that it's taken us some time to get to these questions, but you've posted a bunch, so we're just doing one at a time. Ask a woman whether misogynistic laws are political. Nate, this goes back to where we were saying that this test isn't about racism or misogyny.
There's none of that in there. I didn't at any point give like, here's what a Nazi would think. I mean, there's certain things that I just reject. So that's not in there.
Yeah. And yeah, I actually would take issue with that point. I think there are laws. So there are laws that have impacts on maybe specifically women, and we can think of those laws. I'm not going to say it again because it just the word causes great uproar. And there are people that support those laws for differing reasons. Some of them, yes, because they are misogynistic, and that's their belief is that they don't care about what a woman's whatever opinion is on it. But for others, it is a religious issue. For others, it is another issue, or they believe some other thing. So I think conflating the reason people stand for laws or for issues, just because two people agree on an issue doesn't mean they necessarily have the same reasoning for standing for that perspective.
Yeah, that's a classic case of projecting the viewpoint of, in this case, it's liberty loving. That it's the issue is basically about the liberty of the woman to do what she wants, over onto the other people's point of view, the authority respecting point of view, which they're not framing it in those terms. They're not thinking we must keep. I mean, some of them are, to be clear, but a lot of them are not saying we must keep people from expressing their liberty. And you can, there's examples going the other way too. I don't mean to make it a whole thing about this particular issue, but yeah, the idea is to be able to think from other people's point of view, and you can still disagree with it, but you got to be able to think from their point of view.
Yep. And so then the other question that Kenneth asked was, and I haven't read through this all yet, but help for the poor often sounds unfair to people who have never been poor. That's why I have these tests. They poll for subjects that people are ignorant of. I'm not sure I follow that question or comment, but that might just be because I haven't digested it yet.
Yeah. Can you read the first sentence again, Ari?
Help for the poor often sounds unfair to people who have never been poor. So in other words,
okay.
Someone
who... So yeah, if you've grown up wealthy, help for the poor just seems obviously like, why should they?
Oh, and he said that's why I have these tests, but I think that's why he said what he meant was that's why I hate these tests. They poll for subjects that people are ignorant of. And Kenneth, now I understand what you're asking. And actually, maybe we didn't make it clear in the beginning, but when you take the test, you can skip questions. You can choose as many answers as you want to each question. That's actually the beauty of the test, that you are allowed to express your ignorance on certain subjects, or and your level of it, right? Like if you select all of the answers to a question, you're probably very informed about the subject, because your perspective on it is able to embrace a diversity of perspectives. Whereas if you skip the question, maybe you just haven't thought about it as much, or if you just choose one answer, perhaps you're very narrow-minded on that particular subject and ignorant of the other perspectives.
Perhaps, or perhaps you just think you've got it and that these other people are wrong, and that's fine too. Like I hesitate to be fully on board with like the best result is to be fully expansive. I don't think I would be. I haven't taken the test with my own ideas, which maybe I should at some point. But I don't know if I would be an expansive pluralist or a moderate centrist, which is where they're closer together and yet still pretty balanced. I think I'd be one of those two, but I'm not sure which. But I'm not trying to be too prescriptive about it. Although my preference to be very open is either of those two, as opposed to what's called the ideologue result, where you're fully on board with one thing and reject others.
Right, but it is that thing where it's like what I just said made it sound like, well, the right answer to this test is choosing every answer to every question, and that's not true, because ultimately, if someone is political and says everyone's perspective is right completely and we should adopt, then that's not valuable, right?
Yeah,
then you're basically indecisive. So there's a balance.
Or just wishy-washy and overly motivated by feeling and not by the reality on the ground.
Right, and appealing and being appealing to people pleasing, rather than actually being practical, right? There's a level of like balancing pragmatism and understanding and all of these things. But that's why this test exists. Like we said, there's actually, if you come out as a hard ideologue, that's not bad. We are not applying values to these things. We just want people to understand themselves and what the relationship between these concepts are in a deeper and more nuanced way. Rather than, and we're trying to basically break free of the notion that we are all in these little boxes of I'm a libertarian and I'm a Republican and I'm a Democrat and I'm a socialist, because none of us are one thing. And that's the problem, that flattening of human consciousness and political identity is what has led us to this point where we can't have conversations anymore. And to go full circle to Kenneth's initial question, which is what does this have to do with the reconstitution? That's what it is. The reconstitution is all about a national conversation about very deep issues that affect us in the future of our country, of our world, of our government, and of people. And we can't have that conversation until people start to acknowledge nuance, be willing to understand themselves and their own perspectives, and to accept people in their full multidimensionality, rather than looking at individual human beings as political abstractions, right? And that's the thing that we're trying to overcome here, which is very related to the goals of the Reconstitution.
Well said.
So, Nate, do you have any closing thoughts? I don't see any other questions coming in.
I hope you all take the test. It's pluralpolitics.com. It's a fun time, even if aside from all this stuff, it's just fun to, at the end of the day, it's a quiz. But hey, thank you all for being here.
Thank you. It's been great questions. TikTok, YouTube, Facebook. Anyone who joined us on Instagram, I know you can't post questions, but thank you so much for joining. We will be back with a constitutional conversation number 10 in 2 weeks from now. And we will be talking about, it'll be our first conversation about corporations, and specifically about co-determination, which is a new concept that's been implemented somewhat in Europe, but we're discussing here about how that can improve the relationship between corporations and human beings. Thank you, Skeptic Talker. It was really great having you in those deep conversations. Follow us, check out our other videos. I think you'll like them. Everyone else, thanks again, and we'll be back in a couple of weeks. Look out for our content coming up. Thank you, Nate. And
thank you, Ari.
Last plug, take the test, pluralpolitics.com.